What if I told you that World War I wasn't just about European powers clashing over territory, but actually reshaped the entire global order in ways we're still feeling today? The story you're about to hear involves four nations that would forge an alliance so powerful it would crush the ambitions of Germany and its allies, but at a cost so devastating that it would haunt generations. Stick around because by the end of this video, you'll understand how a single assassination in a place most people couldn't find on a map triggered the first truly global war in human history. Picture this. It's 1914, and the world is about to explode. Not literally, though it might as well have been. In the span of just a few weeks, what started as a regional conflict in the Balkans snowballed into a catastrophe that would consume entire continents. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't just Europeans fighting Europeans. This was the moment when the English-speaking world truly came together as a unified force, and their combined might would prove absolutely devastating. Let me paint you a picture of just how interconnected this web of alliances really was. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, it set off a chain reaction that nobody could have predicted. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia backed Serbia. Germany backed Austria-Hungary. France was obligated to support Russia. And when Germany invaded Belgium to get to France, Britain had no choice but to enter the war. But here's where it gets really interesting. When Britain declared war, it wasn't just Britain that went to war. The British Empire in 1914 was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It controlled roughly a quarter of the world's landmass and population. When Britain said jump, dozens of nations and territories asked how high. But three dominions would play absolutely crucial roles in this conflict: Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, though we're focusing on the first two today alongside Britain and their eventual ally, the United States. Now, you might be thinking, why did America even get involved? After all, this was a European war, right? Well, that's where this story gets really compelling. America initially wanted nothing to do with this European mess. President Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," but Germany had other plans. The Germans made a series of catastrophic decisions that would ultimately seal their fate. First, they resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, meaning they would sink any ship, including American vessels, that they suspected of carrying supplies to their enemies. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, one of the most boneheaded diplomatic moves in history. Germany actually proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. When British intelligence intercepted this message and shared it with America, public opinion shifted dramatically. But even before America officially entered the war in April 1917, the other three members of our alliance were already locked in a brutal struggle with Germany and the Central Powers. And let me tell you, the scale of their commitment was absolutely staggering. Britain didn't just send a few regiments overseas and hope for the best. They transformed their entire society into a war machine. The British Expeditionary Force that landed in France in August 1914 was small but professional. However, Britain quickly realized they would need millions of men, not thousands. They implemented conscription for the first time in their history, ultimately mobilizing over 5 million men. British factories worked around the clock, producing everything from rifles to artillery shells to aircraft. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Britain's dominions didn't have to fight. They could have stayed home, safe across the oceans. Instead, they threw themselves into this conflict with an enthusiasm that still amazes historians today. Take Canada, for instance. With a population of just over 7 million people, Canada contributed over 600,000 men to the war effort. That's nearly 10% of their entire population in uniform. Canadian forces quickly earned a reputation as some of the most effective troops on the Western Front. They played crucial roles in major battles like Vimy Ridge, which became a defining moment in Canadian national identity. Australia's contribution was equally impressive. Despite being geographically isolated and having a population of less than 5 million, Australia sent over 400,000 men to fight. Australian and New Zealand forces, known as Anzacs, became legendary for their courage and tenacity. Their baptism of fire at Gallipoli, though ultimately a defeat, became a source of national pride that persists to this day. Now, what made these four nations such a formidable alliance wasn't just their numbers, though those were impressive. It was how they complemented each other's strengths. Britain brought naval supremacy, industrial capacity, and global reach. The Royal Navy's control of the seas was absolutely crucial. They established a blockade of Germany that slowly strangled. The Central Powers' ability to import essential goods and materials. Canada and Australia brought raw materials, food production, and manpower. Canada became Britain's arsenal, producing massive quantities of shells, rifles, and other military equipment. Australian wool kept Allied soldiers warm, while Canadian wheat helped feed the British Isles when German submarines threatened to starve Britain into submission. But it was America's entry into the war that truly tipped the scales. The United States brought something the Allies desperately needed by 1917: fresh troops and virtually unlimited industrial capacity. American factories could outproduce German industry several times over. More importantly, while European nations had been bleeding themselves white for 3 years, America had millions of young men ready to fight. The American Expeditionary Force, led by General John J. Pershing, insisted on fighting as an independent army rather than being absorbed into British or French units. This decision proved crucial. American forces played decisive roles in stopping the German Spring Offensive of 1918 and then spearheading the Allied counteroffensive that finally broke German resistance. But let's talk about what they were up against, because Germany and the Central Powers were no pushovers. Germany in 1914 had the best army in the world, pound for pound. Their military machine was incredibly efficient, their officers were superbly trained, and their industrial base was second only to America's. They had spent decades preparing for this exact scenario, a war on multiple fronts against a coalition of enemies. Germany's strategy, known as the Schlieffen Plan, was actually quite brilliant on paper. They would quickly defeat France in the west, then pivot all their forces to deal with Russia in the east. For a few terrifying weeks in August and September 1914, it almost worked. German forces swept through Belgium and northern France, coming within striking distance of Paris itself. But this is where the Allied alliance showed its first signs of strength. British forces, though small, helped slow the German advance just enough. The famous Battle of the Marne in September 1914 stopped the Germans cold, just when victory seemed within their grasp. This single battle probably saved the Allied cause, because if Germany had knocked France out of the war in 1914, Britain and its dominions would have faced a nearly impossible task. The Central Powers also included Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and later Bulgaria. On paper, this looked formidable. In reality, Austria-Hungary was barely holding together even before the war started. The Ottoman Empire controlled strategic territories but was militarily weak. Only Germany was truly pulling its weight, and that put enormous pressure on German resources. As the war dragged on, the advantages of the Allied alliance became increasingly apparent. While Germany was slowly being strangled by the British naval blockade, the Allies had access to global resources: Canadian grain, Australian wool, American steel, and raw materials from across the British Empire kept the Allied war machine running. The technological innovation that emerged from this alliance was also remarkable. British scientists developed new weapons and tactics. Canadian engineers perfected artillery techniques that proved devastatingly effective. American industry revolutionized mass production methods that could turn out weapons and equipment at unprecedented rates. But perhaps most importantly, these four nations learned to fight as a coordinated team. By 1918, British, Canadian, Australian, and American forces were operating with a level of cooperation that the Central Powers simply couldn't match. They shared intelligence, coordinated attacks, and supported each other's operations in ways that maximized their combined effectiveness. The human cost of this alliance's victory was staggering. Britain lost nearly 1 million men. Canada suffered over 60,000 deaths from a tiny population. Australia lost more than 60,000 as well. The United States, despite entering late, lost over 100,000 soldiers. But Germany and its allies paid an even higher price, losing millions of men and ultimately facing complete military collapse. The final German offensive in spring 1918 was their last desperate gamble. For a few months, it looked like they might actually break through Allied lines. German forces advanced further than they had since 1914, threatening to split the British and French armies. But this offensive was also Germany's death knell. They threw everything they had into this attack, and when it failed, they had nothing left. The Allied counteroffensive that followed was relentless. American troops provided the fresh manpower needed to sustain attacks. British forces, supported by Canadian and Australian units, smashed through German defensive lines that had held for years. By November 1918, German forces were in full retreat, their allies were abandoning them, and revolution was brewing at home. When Germany finally sued for peace on November 11, 1918, it marked the end of the first truly global conflict in human history. But the victory of America, Britain, Canada, and Australia over Germany and the Central Powers did more than just end a war. It established a new world order that would shape the next century. The relationship forged between these four nations during World War I became the foundation for future cooperation. The special relationship between America and Britain, the strong ties between Britain and its former dominions, and the shared values and experiences of fighting together created bonds that proved crucial in World War II and beyond. But the victory also came with consequences that nobody fully understood at the time. The harsh treatment of Germany in the Treaty of Versailles would create resentments that would fuel the rise of Adolf Hitler. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire would redraw the map of the Middle East in ways that still cause conflicts today. The financial cost of the war would contribute to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Looking back over a century later, World War I represents both the triumph and the tragedy of modern warfare. The alliance of America, Britain, Canada, and Australia proved that democratic nations could unite in the face of existential threats and prevail through superior coordination, industrial capacity, and sheer determination. Their victory preserved democratic values and self-determination for millions of people. Yet this victory came at such an enormous cost in human lives and suffering that it should serve as a permanent reminder of war's true price. The young men who marched off to war in 1914, singing songs and expecting to be home by Christmas, could never have imagined the industrial-scale slaughter that awaited them. The generation that fought this war was scarred by experiences that were literally unprecedented in human history. Today, as we face new global challenges and international tensions, the story of World War I offers both inspiration and warning. It shows us what free nations can accomplish when they stand together against tyranny and aggression. But it also reminds us that even just wars exact a terrible price, and that the goal should always be preventing conflicts before they spiral out of control. The alliance that won World War I wasn't perfect. These nations made mistakes, both during the war and in its aftermath, but they demonstrated something profound about the power of democratic solidarity. When faced with an existential threat, America, Britain, Canada, and Australia put aside their differences, pooled their resources, and fought together until victory was achieved. That legacy of cooperation continues today in organizations like NATO and in the ongoing partnerships between these nations. The bonds forged in the trenches of France and Flanders over a century ago still influence international relations and continue to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. The next time you see these four flags flying together at an international event or military ceremony, remember that their partnership was literally forged in fire and blood during humanity's first global war, proving that sometimes the price of freedom really is eternal vigilance and the willingness to stand together when everything we hold dear hangs in the balance.